long before Britain became England, Scotland, or Wales. Before Roman roads cut the island into straight lines. Before castles rose over conquered ground. Before surnames fix families onto parchment. Britain belonged to peoples whose names now sound like fragments carried in from the edge of memory. The Iceni, the Brigantes, the Silures, the Ordovices, the Dumnonii, the Trinovantes, the Parisi, the Atabates, the Cornavii, the Votadini. They ruled valleys, guarded rivers, built hill forts, forged alliances, buried their dead with meaning and passed identity from one generation to the next. But what if history did not truly forget these peoples? What if it only forgot their names? And what if the tribe that once inhabited the region your family came from is not merely part of British history but part of your own story? By the end of this documentary, you will discover who Britain's forgotten tribes were, where they lived, what happened when Rome arrived, how archaeology and ancient DNA are rebuilding their lost worlds, and whether clues in your own family history must still point toward one of these remarkable peoples. If you are fascinated by the hidden history behind British ancestry, subscribe to UK Bloodlines and join our growing community uncovering the stories concealed inside family trees. And before we begin, tell us your surname and the oldest British county connected to your family. By the end of this story, you may see both very differently. To enter Britain before Britain, you have to let the modern map dissolve. There was no England, no Scotland, no Wales, no United Kingdom, no counties as we recognise them today. Instead, there were river territories, defended heights, sacred places, trackways threading through forests, and networks of communities bound by kinship, loyalty, territory, and political identity. Some controlled enormous confederations, some dominated strategic valleys or coastlines. Some minted coins bearing the names of rulers, some traded across the Channel. Others fought Rome with such determination that their enemies preserved their names in anger. These were not primitive people waiting for civilization to arrive. They inhabited a complex island world with rulers, rivalries, diplomacy, craftsmanship, religious customs, and inherited landscapes. And yet most people today could probably name more Roman emperors than British tribes. Why are the conquerors better remembered than the people who were already here? The answer begins with silence. Most of Britain's tribal societies did not leave lengthy written chronicles in forms later historians could preserve. Their stories survive in fragments, a tribal name recorded by Tacitus, a line in Ptolemy, a coin hoard stamped with a ruler's title, a hill fort reconstructed over generations, an unusual burial custom, or a place name older than English. Archaeology does not provide a complete script. It gives us clues. Historical linguistics preserves echoes. The landscape preserves patterns of settlement. Genetics now adds another extraordinary layer of evidence. But none of these fields speaks alone. Britain's forgotten tribes must be reconstructed in much the same way as a family mystery, patiently, from fragments that only become meaningful when placed together. That matters because you are not standing outside this story, you are inside it. If your family has deep roots in one part of Britain, one county, one coastline, one valley, or one market town, then this is not simply a documentary about distant ancient peoples. It is an investigation into the oldest identifiable human worlds that may have shaped your ancestry. This is your first ancestry checkpoint. Where did your oldest known ancestors live? Did your family remain within the same region for several generations? Does one county repeatedly appear in your family tree, almost as though your line was continually pulled back toward it? Keep that place in mind, because the tribal names that follow may suddenly feel much less distant. In eastern Britain, among the flatlands, riverways, and open skies of what is now Norfolk and parts of Suffolk, live the Iceni. Today, popular memory reduces them to one blazing image: Boudica against Rome, chariots in motion, Roman towns burning, an empire briefly thrown into panic. But if rebellion is all we remember, the deepest part of the Iceni story disappears. Long before the uprising, this was already a powerful society rooted in East Anglia, wealthy enough to mint distinctive coins, connected enough to matter politically, and confident enough to negotiate with Rome before eventually turning against it. The real mystery is not how the Iceni fought. It is how they survived what followed. Once the rebellion was crushed, What happened to the ordinary households of Iceni territory? What happened to the farmers whose families had worked those fields for generations? The women who raised children there and the young people born into a land suddenly absorbed into an empire? The most plausible answer is also the most human. Many of them went nowhere. Their rulers changed. Their political identity changed. Their settlements entered a Roman world. But the population of the region did not simply vanish. It became part of Roman Britain. So if your family comes from Norfolk or Suffolk, if East Anglia is the landscape your ancestors continually return to, the Iceni are not merely famous figures from an ancient textbook. They are the first great forgotten question, hanging over the place your family called home. Further north stretched the territory of the Brigantes, one of the largest and most politically significant peoples in Britain. Their influence covered much of what is now northern England, a vast world of uplands, pasture, strategic routes, hillforts and competing centres of power. Here the ancestry mystery changes shape. With the Iceni, the question is survival after catastrophe. With the Brigantes, it is what happens when an enormous confederation begins to fragment under pressure. Roman writers remembered queens, rival leaders, and alliances breaking apart. Yet large populations do not vanish neatly when political organizations collapse. They divide, adapt, relocate, intermarry, and become part of the communities that follow them. Yorkshire, Durham, Cumbria, Lancashire, and the Pennine world all lie within the wider Brigantian question. If your family ancestry sits within that northern arc, ask yourself this: how much of the population of later northern Britain was built upon people who already belonged to these lands long before medieval kingdoms took shape? The next time someone says the ancient tribes disappeared, remember that sometimes it is not the people who disappear. It is the label dot in southeast Wales. The Silures entered written history as a nightmare for Rome. Roman authors describe them as tenacious, defiant, and exceptionally difficult to subdue. Their homeland, shaped by hills, valleys, and defensive terrain, favored entrance. But the deeper Silurian story is not simply one of resistance. It is persistence in place. Some landscapes appear to preserve stronger continuity than others, not untouched or unmixed ancestry, but a long tradition of local communities, remaining through repeated political change. If your roots lie in southeast Wales, Monmouthshire, Glamorgan, or the surrounding borderlands, the Silures are compelling not because a modern surname or DNA test can prove direct tribal descent. They matter because this is precisely the sort of region where populations could remain while rulers rotated above them. Empires came, administrations changed, the language of power shifted, yet families continued living where previous generations had lived before them. That is the Silurian mystery, not simply whether they fought Rome, but whether many of their descendants never truly left. The Ordovices of northwest Wales carry a different kind of power. Their story rises out of mountain country. Roman sources remember them because they destroyed a cavalry unit and provoked a brutal imperial response. Yet this is only the brief flash recorded by outsiders. Rome saw moments of conflict. It did not record the slower lives of farming communities, family networks, seasonal movements, and traditions shaped by upland isolation. Here the central question is whether difficult terrain can preserve local identity longer than lowland politics ever could. If your family comes from Gwynedd or the surrounding regions, if your ancestry seems tied to places where the land itself feels like an inheritance, then the Ordovices embody one of Britain's oldest historical truths: mountains do not forget quickly, and when the landscape holds memory, families sometimes carry parts of it forward, even after the original name of that identity has disappeared. In the southwest, the Dumnonii occupied a peninsula that still feels distinctive today. Devon and Cornwall project into the Atlantic like a world with one shoulder turned slightly away from the rest of Britain. That sense of separation is ancient. The Dumnonii inhabited a region shaped by coastlines, sea routes, mineral wealth, local customs, and long-distance connections. Their mystery is not defined by one rebellion or famous battle. It is the mystery of continuity at the edge of the island. What happens to communities living at Britain's far western end, within a landscape that retains a powerful regional character across centuries? That may help explain why so many families from Cornwall and Devon describe their belonging with unusual depth, as though being from there means something older than a modern county boundary. The Dumnonii no longer survive as a political name. Yet families with deep West Country roots, especially Cornish roots, may come from one of Britain's most plausible landscapes for long-term connections between ancient and later populations. Not pure, not isolated, not exclusive, but potentially very deep. And by now, you may already have recognized your own region. Perhaps Norfolk called to mind an East Anglian grandparent. Perhaps Yorkshire, South East Wales, Gwynedd, Devon or Cornwall appears repeatedly in your family records, but we have only travelled halfway across the tribal map. Because the next peoples reveal something even more surprising. Ancient Britain was not merely a collection of isolated local communities. Some tribal societies were connected to continental Europe, engaged in sophisticated diplomacy, and positioned at the centre of political worlds that later history almost completely buried. To find them, we must turn toward the southeast, the Midlands and the frontier, that would one day divide England from Scotland. Near what later became one of Roman Britain's most heavily transformed regions, lived the Trinovantes. Their territory included much of what is now Essex and neighbouring areas, and their fate presents one of the strangest ancestry mysteries of all. What happens when an important people are buried beneath so much later history that a metropolis rises almost on top of their memory? The Trinovantes mattered before the Roman conquest. They were involved in the politics that shaped Britain's earliest encounters with Rome. Their rulers, territories, and alliances were significant enough to appear in ancient accounts. Yet in the modern imagination, they vanish beneath London, Roman urbanization, and the succession of kingdoms that followed. Their mystery is disappearance through overbuilding. If your ancestry is rooted in Essex or the old southeastern villages beyond London's expanding shadow, the Trinovantes remind us that ancient peoples did not always fade because they lacked importance. Sometimes they faded because too much history was built over them. Then the investigation takes an unexpected turn in East Yorkshire with the Parisii. Archaeologists have long been fascinated by this region because of its distinctive Aras culture and unusual burial traditions, including famous chariot burials. Suddenly, this is not merely a story about survival in one place. It becomes a story about identity shaped through connection. Were the Parisii migrants from continental Europe? Were they a local population adopting prestigious foreign customs? Were they ruled by an elite network with relationships across the North Sea and Channel? The evidence does not permit one simple answer, and that is precisely why the Parisii are so intriguing. They show that Britain was never completely isolated. People, technologies, objects, customs and status symbols crossed the water long before Rome's legions arrived. If your family comes from East Yorkshire, the Parisii raise to possibilities. Your roots in that landscape may be extremely old, but they may also descend from a region whose identity was already layered, outward-looking and far more difficult to classify than later national histories suggest. South of the Thames, the Atabates reveal a Britain far more politically sophisticated than many viewers expect. Their rulers operated in a world of diplomacy, coinage, trade and changing alliances. This was not an isolated tribal backwater. It was a kingdom communicating with continental Europe while responding to Rome's growing influence. The Atabates overturned the lazy assumption that Britain's peoples remained static until foreigners arrived to transform them. Some were already negotiating power on an international stage. If your ancestry lies in Hampshire, Berkshire, Sussex, or the surrounding southern regions, then the oldest identifiable setting of your family story may not have been isolated at all. Your distant ancestors may have lived in a landscape shaped by mobility, political ambition, and cross-channel contact, a landscape standing remarkably close to one of history's great turning points. In the Midlands and the Western Central Zone, the Cordovices are easy to overlook precisely because they lack a single dramatic legend in popular memory. No Boudica, no famous last stand, no iconic rebellion schoolchildren are taught to remember, and that may make them one of the most important peoples in this story. Because most ancestry does not descend from celebrated rebels or royal dynasties, it descends from ordinary continuity. The Cordovices occupied a strategic region of hill forts, agricultural communities and movements between western and central Britain. Their mystery is quiet survival. If your family comes from Shropshire, Cheshire or the Central West, the Cordovices represent the kind of people who may have passed into later Britain with very little theatrical interruption. No grand disappearance, no dramatic curtain fall, just generations continuing under new political skies. Sometimes the oldest ancestry survives best where history made the least noise, and along the eastern side of the north, reaching into what became Northumberland, Lothian and the Scottish borders, live the Votadini. They stand at a threshold. Their significance is not only tribal, but transitional. This is the part of Britain where Roman frontiers, post-Roman Brittonic kingdoms, and later medieval identities collided and overlapped. The Votadini matter because they seem to point forward. Their world appears to flow into later northern British polities rather than simply vanishing. So if your family comes from the borders, Lothian or Northumberland, their mystery is especially powerful. Could your ancestry reach back not just to a forgotten tribe, but to one of the population groups that helped bridge ancient Britain into the post-Roman age? Before this became a hard border between nations, it was already somebody's homeland. Families were already there. That is the memory the Votadini preserve. This is the next ancestry checkpoint. Which of these regions sounds most like your family? Norfolk, Yorkshire, South East Wales, Gwynedd, Devon, Cornwall, Essex, East Yorkshire, Hampshire, Shropshire, Northumberland, the borders. And when you hear one of those places, do you think only of geography or of belonging? Because this is the point where the documentary stops being a sequence of tribal names and becomes something more intimate. The forgotten tribes matter not simply because they existed, but because they may still survive as the deep human background of the places where families remained. Then Rome arrived and shattered the balance. The invasion did not fall upon an empty island. It fell upon existing worlds. Roads were cut across tribal lands. Forts rose above strategic routes. Client rulers were used and discarded. Trade expanded. Towns flourished. Local elites adopted Roman styles. Some communities benefited. Others resisted. Many did both at different times. Smoke rose over Britain. Legions advanced into territories whose people had lived there for generations. This is the chapter school history remembers because Rome wrote it down. But the great ancestry question lies beneath the conquest. What happened to the people once the banners changed? Boudica's revolt gives us one answer. It is often remembered as spectacle, revenge, destruction, heroic defiance, but its deeper importance here is human. The region did not become empty after the rebellion failed. Households survived, settlements continued. The remaining population became part of Roman Britain. And the same basic truth applies elsewhere, even if the details differed. Rome conquered territory, but not ancestry. It transformed political identity, economic structures and public life. It did not replace every local population. In some regions, Roman rule created deep cultural fusion. In others, local habits persisted beneath imperial forms. But Rome was not the end of these peoples. It was the beginning of their next disguise. Still, archaeology and landscape can only take the investigation so far. Coins, forts, burial sites and place names tell us where people lived and how they lived. They do not fully answer the hardest question of all. Did the people themselves remain? To push further, researchers turn to evidence no Roman historian could manipulate and no medieval chronicler could rewrite. Evidence preserved inside ancient bones. And this is where the story changes. Ancient DNA transformed the discussion of Britain's past because it challenged the old habit of imagining history as a sequence of total replacements. The older popular model was simple and dramatic. One people arrive, another people vanish. Celts, then Romans, then Anglo-Saxons, then Vikings, as though each new wave wiped the human slate clean. The genetic evidence points to something more uneven and more interesting. Britain did experience major migrations and real demographic change, especially in some regions and periods. But that change was not identical everywhere, and it was not a universal erasure of earlier populations. In parts of Britain, continuity from earlier populations appears stronger than older narratives once allowed. In others, incoming ancestry had a larger impact. That means the human story of Britain is not one replacement. It is a patchwork. That patchwork matters enormously for ancestry. It means your family story depends on where your people were, not only on what happened to Britain as a whole. Eastern and southeastern England experienced substantial later demographic change. Western Britain often preserves stronger signals of long-term continuity. Border regions tell their own story, the north tells another. There is no single tribal answer for every viewer. And that is precisely what makes this investigation feel real other than romantic. But careful wording matters. DNA can identify patterns within populations. It cannot identify your exact Iron Age tribe. Tribes were political and social identities, not genetic boxes. They mixed, shifted, split, absorbed neighbors and changed over time. A modern DNA test cannot tell you that you are Iceni or Brigantian. What it can sometimes do, especially when paired with geography and family history, is support the possibility that your ancestors came from populations with very deep regional roots. This is the next ancestry checkpoint. What is the oldest county in your family tree? How far back can you trace that line? Did your ancestors remain in one part of Britain long enough for regional continuity to matter? Have you ever looked at a family surname and asked not only where it appears in records, but what older landscape lies beneath those records? Because this is where the story becomes personal. If your family is from Norfolk or Suffolk, then Iceni territory is part of the ancestral backdrop, whether or not you can prove anything more specific. If your roots are in Yorkshire, you may stand somewhere between Brigantian and Parisy pasts, depending on the region. If your people are from Devon or Cornwall, the Dumnonii become difficult to ignore. Essex recalls the Trinovantes, southeast Wales raises the Silures. Gwynedd points toward the Ordovices, the central west evokes the Cornovae. Northumberland and the borders reopen the Votadini. These are not verdicts, they are clues. But for most families, clues are exactly what have been missing. People stop at the census, they stop at parish registers. They stop at the first surname they can document. They rarely ask the more unsettling question. What named people lived in this same landscape before England even existed? Place names can help. Rivers are often among the oldest linguistic survivors in any landscape. A river may preserve memory older than the kingdom built beside it. Hill names, valley names and settlement names can preserve Brittonic layers or other ancient elements long after the language of power has changed. So if your family comes from a village name that does not feel transparently English, that may not prove tribal descent, but it may suggest the landscape has held on to older memory. Archaeology sharpens the picture further. A nearby hillfort, an ancient enclosure, an old routeway, a persistent settlement cluster. These are not merely heritage markers. They are signs that people kept finding the same places worth living in. Parish records and local history can sharpen the story further still. If a surname remains concentrated in one district for centuries, if marriages stayed local, if old occupations tied generations to the same ground, then deep regional ancestry becomes more plausible. Folklore matters, regional identity matters. So do those stubborn family habits that never make it into official history. The sense that your people are from there, in a way that feels older than modern mobility. If you have recognized your family's region, comment with your surname, the oldest county in your tree, and how far back you have traced the line. Because when enough families begin asking these questions together, the map of Britain starts to look less like a national story and more like a mosaic of inherited local pasts, and perhaps that is the greatest forgotten legacy of Britain's tribes. They disappeared politically, but not necessarily biologically. Their names faded from power, their territories were redrawn. Their descendants became part of later Brittonic kingdoms, Roman Britain, medieval England, Wales, Scotland, and the countless diaspora families scattered across the world. They did not survive as pure, sealed identities. They survived the way almost all real ancestry survives, through mixture, adaptation, and persistence. History remembers kingdoms, because kingdoms leave chronicles, families leave descendants. That may be why this subject feels so powerful once it takes hold of you. It restores ordinary people to the center of Britain's oldest named past, not emperors, not dynasties, families, the households who stayed when rule changed, the communities who adjusted to new languages and loyalties, the people who outlived every political label placed over them. When you look at your own family tree, the trail eventually goes cold. The records run out, the names stop, the parchment ends. But the human story does not end there. It continues backward into landscapes, populations and forgotten peoples, whose memory was never fully erased, only buried beneath later history. So perhaps the greatest mystery is not what happened to Britain's forgotten tribes. Perhaps it is that many of their descendants have been living among us all along, carrying fragments of those lost worlds in places they still call home. Long before Britain had kings. Before borders. Before even the name Britain meant what it means now. Ordinary families were already living beside these rivers, farming these valleys, crossing these moors, and raising children beneath these same skies. Empires came, kingdoms rose and fell. Names changed, languages shifted, yet people endured. Their descendants became Britons, Welsh, Scots, English, and families across the wider world, who may never have realized how ancient their story truly is. And if your family has ever wondered where it really begins, perhaps the answer is older than any surname, older than any parish register, older even than England itself. Perhaps it begins with one of Britain's forgotten tribes, waiting, all this time, for you to remember them. In the Midlands and the Western Central Zone, the Conquest are easy to overlook precisely because they lack one dramatic image in popular memory. There is no Cornovian equivalent of Boudica, no famous final battle retold in countless documentaries, no instantly recognizable legend. That may make them one of the most important peoples in this investigation. Most ancestry does not descend from famous rebels, rulers, or dynasties. It descends from ordinary continuity. The Conquest occupied a significant region of agricultural settlements, major hill forts and strategic routes connecting different parts of Britain. Their territory is generally associated with what is now Shropshire, Cheshire, and surrounding districts. Their mystery is quiet survival. If your family comes from the Central West or the Welsh Marches, the Conquest may represent the kind of population that passed into later Britain with little theatrical interruption. There was no grand disappearance, no dramatic historical curtain, just generations continuing beneath changing political skies. Sometimes the oldest ancestry survives most successfully in the places where written history made the least noise, along the eastern side of the north, extending into what later became Northumberland, Lothian, and the Scottish borders, live the Votadini. They stand at a threshold. Their importance is not merely tribal but transitional. This is part of Britain where Roman frontiers, post-Roman Brittonic kingdoms, and later medieval identities collided and overlapped. The Votadini matter because their world appears to flow into later northern British political societies, rather than simply ending. Their story gives us a rare bridge between the tribal map of Iron Age Britain and the kingdoms that emerged after Rome. If your family comes from the borders, Lothian or Northumberland, their mystery is especially powerful. Could your ancestry stretch back not only to a forgotten tribe, but to one of the populations that helped carry ancient Britain into the post-Roman age? Before this land became a contested border between nations, it was already somebody's homeland. Families were already farming there, raising children, defending settlements, and placing their dead into the earth. That is the memory the Votadini preserve. Now consider the full tribal map. Norfolk and Suffolk evoke the Iceni. Much of northern England recalls the Brigantes. Southeast Wales points toward the Silures, while Gwynedd raises the Ordovices. Devon and Cornwall belong to the old world of the Dumnonii. Essex carries the buried memory of the Trinovantes. East Yorkshire opens the mystery of the Parisii. Hampshire, Berkshire, and Sussex recall the Atabates. Shropshire and Cheshire point toward the Conquest. Northumberland, Lothian, and the borders reopen the world of the Votadini. Which of those regions resembles your family's oldest known home? When you hear its name, do you think only of geography, or do you feel something closer to belonging? The forgotten tribes are not fascinating merely because they existed. They matter because they may form part of the deep human background of regions where families remained long after the old tribal names disappeared. Then Rome arrived and shattered the political balance. The invasion did not fall upon an empty or disorganized island. It fell upon existing worlds. Roman roads were driven across tribal territories. Forts rose above strategic routes. Client rulers were rewarded and later discarded. Taxes were imposed, trade expanded, towns appeared. Local elites adopted Roman architecture, clothing, food, and political customs. Some communities benefited from the new order. Others resisted it. Many probably did both at different times. Smoke rose above settlements as Roman forces pushed deeper into territories whose populations had inhabited them for generations. This is the chapter traditional history remembers most clearly because Rome wrote it down. But the great ancestry question lies beneath the conquest. What happened to the people after the banners changed? Boudica's revolt provides part of the answer. It is usually remembered as spectacle, revenge, destruction, heroic defiance, and burning Roman towns. But its deeper importance here is demographic and human. Eastern Britain did not become empty after the rebellion failed. Households survived, settlements continued. Children grew up under Roman authority. The remaining population entered the changing society of Roman Britain. The same principle applied across much of the island, although each region experienced conquest differently. Rome conquered territory, destroyed some political institutions, and transformed public life. It did not replace every local population. In certain places, Roman rule encouraged intense cultural mixture. Soldiers arrived from across the empire. Merchants traveled. Towns attracted migrants. Local people intermarried with newcomers and adopted new customs. In other regions, traditional settlement patterns and local habits remained more persistent beneath the outward forms of empire. Rome was not the end of Britain's tribal populations. It was the beginning of their next disguise. But archaeology and landscape can take the investigation only so far. Coins, forts, pottery, burials, and place names tell us where communities lived and offer clues about how they organized their societies. They cannot fully answer the hardest question: did the people themselves remain? To push further, researchers turn to evidence that no Roman historian could manipulate and no medieval chronicler could rewrite, evidence preserved inside ancient bones. And this is where the story becomes extraordinary. Ancient DNA transformed our understanding of Britain because it challenged the old habit of imagining history as a simple sequence of replacements. The familiar popular story once sounded almost mechanical. One group arrived and another disappeared. Earlier inhabitants were supposedly replaced by later Celts, then Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Normans, as if every migration wiped the island's human slate clean. The genetic evidence reveals a much more uneven, and far more interesting, story. Britain experienced major migrations and substantial demographic change, but the scale of that change differed dramatically between regions and periods. Some areas received large numbers of newcomers. Other populations retained stronger connections to people who had inhabited their regions much earlier. Migration, continuity, and mixture occurred simultaneously. The human story of Britain is not one replacement, it is a patchwork. One recent ancient DNA investigation made that patchwork strikingly personal. Researchers studied 57 ancient genomes from burial sites associated with the Genealogies, an Iron Age people of southern Britain whose territory centered largely on what is now Dorset and surrounding areas. Within those cemeteries, they identified an extended community centered around a single maternal lineage. Many of the people buried there were connected through the female line, while unrelated individuals entering the group were predominantly male. In other words, rather than women routinely leaving their families to join their husbands' communities, this evidence suggests that some men may have moved into communities organized around generations of related women. Imagine what that means. A grandmother, her daughters, their daughters and their descendants may have formed the enduring center of a community, while men arrived from elsewhere and became part of that family network. For centuries, ancient British society was often imagined mainly through male warriors, chiefs and kings. Yet DNA preserved another possibility inside the bones. In at least some Iron Age communities, women may have been the stable threads holding generations together. The same research also found that Iron Age population history differed sharply across Britain. It reported especially strong earlier regional continuity in Scotland, northern England, and the southwest, while parts of southern coastal Britain displayed more evidence of movement and connection across the Channel. That does not mean those regions were sealed, pure or unchanged. It means geography mattered. Britain's seas, rivers, mountains, and coastlines did not produce one uniform population story. They produced many overlapping histories. Eastern and southeastern England experienced substantial demographic effects from later migration, Western regions often preserve stronger evidence of long-term continuity. Coastal zones could be highly connected to continental Europe. Borderlands followed their own complicated paths, while northern populations experienced different combinations of persistence and movement. Yet careful wording is essential. DNA cannot identify your exact Iron Age tribe. The Iceni, Brigantes, Silures, and other tribal identities were political and social communities, not sealed genetic categories. Their membership could change. Their boundaries were porous. And that is the unforgettable lesson of ancient DNA. Your family's deep ancestry depends not only on what happened to Britain, but on where within Britain your people lived. They traded, fought, absorbed outsiders, formed alliances, and intermarried. A modern commercial DNA test cannot examine your results and declare with scientific certainty that you are Iceni, Brigantian, or Dumnonian. What genetics can reveal are population patterns. When DNA evidence is considered alongside documented family history, regional origins, archaeology, and geography, it can support the possibility that a person descends partly from populations with very deep roots in a particular area. That is not a tribal certificate. It is something more realistic and, in many ways, more meaningful, evidence that human continuity survived beneath repeated changes of identity. This is your next ancestry checkpoint. What is the oldest county appearing in your family tree? How far back can you trace the line? Did your ancestors remain in one region long enough for deep regional continuity to become plausible? Have you ever looked at a surname and asked not merely where it first appears in documents, but what older human landscape existed beneath those documents? Because this is where the story becomes personal. If your family comes from Norfolk or Suffolk, Iceni territory forms part of the region's ancestral background, whether or not a specific connection can ever be proven. If your roots are in Yorkshire, you may be looking toward Brigantian or Parisy territory depending on the area. Devon and Cornwall call the Dumnonii into view. Essex recalls the Trinovantes. Southeast Wales raises the Silures. Gwynedd evokes the Ordovices. Shropshire and Cheshire point toward the Cornevii. Northumberland and the borders reopen the Votadini world. These are not verdicts, they are historical contexts. Yet context is often what family trees are missing. People reach the 19th century census and stop. They reach parish registers and stop. They discover the earliest written form of their surname and assume that is where the family began. But the people in those records did not appear from nowhere. Their human story stretched backward through medieval villages, migrating kingdoms, post-Roman societies, Imperial Britain, and finally into landscapes once occupied by the named peoples of the Iron Age. The more unsettling question is not simply, where does my surname come from? It is this, who lived in my family's region before England, Scotland, or Wales even existed? Place names can offer clues. Rivers are often among the oldest linguistic survivors in a landscape. Kingdoms may rename settlements and conquerors may rebuild towns, but river names frequently resist change. A river can carry a word older than the kingdom that grew beside it. Hill names, valley names, and settlement names may preserve Brittonic or other ancient linguistic elements long after the languages of government and commerce have changed. An unusual village name does not prove tribal descent, but it may reveal that the landscape preserved a memory older than modern English. Archaeology can deepen the picture. A nearby hillfort, ancient enclosure, burial site, routeway, or long-lasting settlement cluster does not prove that your direct ancestors inhabited it, but it demonstrates that generations repeatedly found the same landscape worth defending, cultivating, and calling home. Parish records and local history can then bring the investigation closer to your own family. If a surname remains concentrated within one district for centuries, if marriages repeatedly occur among neighboring villages, if occupations bind several generations to the same ground, then deep regional ancestry becomes more plausible. Regional identity matters too. So do the stubborn family habits that never appear in official documents. The conviction that your people are from there, none away, that feels older than recent mobility. Comment with your surname, the oldest county in your family tree, and how far back you have traced the line. When enough families begin asking these questions, Britain's map starts to look less like one national story and more like a mosaic of inherited local pasts. And perhaps that is the greatest forgotten legacy of Britain's tribes. They disappeared politically, but not necessarily biologically. Their names faded from power, their territories were reorganized. Their descendants became part of Roman Britain, later Brittonic kingdoms, medieval England, Wales and Scotland, and eventually diaspora communities spread across the world. They did not survive as pure or sealed identities. They survived in the way almost all genuine ancestry survives, through movement, mixture, adaptation and persistence. History remembers kingdoms, because kingdoms leave chronicles. Families leave descendants. That may be why this subject becomes so powerful once it takes hold of you. It restores ordinary people to the center of Britain's oldest named past, not emperors, not dynasties, not conquerors first, families, the households that remained when governments changed, the communities that adapted to new languages and loyalties, the people who outlived every political identity imposed upon them. When you examine your family tree, the trail eventually grows cold, the documents run out, the surnames disappear, the parchment ends. But the human story does not end there. It continues backward into landscapes, populations and forgotten peoples, whose memory was never completely erased, only buried beneath later history. So perhaps the greatest mystery is not what happened to Britain's forgotten tribes. Perhaps it is that many of their descendants have been living among us all along, carrying fragments of those lost worlds in regions they still call home, long before Britain had kings. Before modern borders. Before the name Britain meant what it means today. Families were already living beside these rivers, farming these valleys, crossing these moors, and raising children beneath these same skies. Empires came, kingdoms rose and fell, languages shifted, tribal names disappeared. Yet people endured. Their descendants became Britons, Welsh, Scots, English and families scattered across the wider world, who may never have realized how ancient their story truly is. And if you have ever wondered where your family really begins, perhaps the answer is older than your surname, older than any parish register and older, even than England itself. Perhaps it begins with one of Britain's forgotten tribes, waiting all this time for you to remember them. Subscribe to UK Bloodlines for more documentaries uncovering the ancient history hidden behind Britain's surnames, counties and family trees. Your records may end only a few centuries ago, but your story began much earlier.